The goal of this lecture is to introduce you to the different types of circulatory systems that we can find in organisms. So there are there are two main types of circulatory systems, and then some animals who can live without circulatory systems. So we'll talk about the ones without circulatory systems first. Then we'll talk about what's called an open circulatory system, where we have open-ended vessels that bathe the tissues directly in the circulatory fluid. And then we'll talk about closed circulatory systems, which is what we observe in us, for example. So not all animals are going to have to rely on a circulatory system because they are small, very small, or they are flat and can just rely strictly on diffusion to get in key nutrients to their body. Now, you're going to find organisms with no circulatory system to live in aqueous environments. So they're going to be aquatic in some way, and what they're going to do is they're going to get those gases and nutrients by diffusion from the environment into their body. So these are going to be very small, like on the far left we have a rotifer, in the middle this is a tapeworm, and then on the right is a jellyfish. And so these are very small, the rotifers are very small, you can see the tapeworms are thin and flat, and then with the jellyfish, what we see is that they put their active tissues on the outside of their body, allowing them to directly interact with the surrounding water. But we know this doesn't work in large animals because remember that you can only be a few cell layers thick for diffusion to really be as an effective means of getting oxygen or nutrients to all of your body cells. And so what we see is the evolution of circulatory systems that contain some sort of transport tissue. So blood and hemolymph, which we'll be talking about, are technically considered connective tissues in the body, and they are going to reach every single cell of the body either by directly bathing those cells in open circulatory systems or by vessels branching to the point of such a fine point that they come into contact with every cell like we see in closed circulatory systems. So open circulatory systems, we find these in insects and in mollusks such as clams, and their connective tissue, their fluid connective tissue is called hemolymph. Now, what's interesting about hemolymph is that it does not stay contained to vessels. So what we see is if we look at the diagram on the right here, you see that there is a heart here, and we do have vessels, but the vessels are open-ended. And so what happens is that the fluid gets drawn in, and then the heart pumps it, and then the fluid goes out and bathes the tissues directly with the hemolymph. Now, I just want to mention here that for some of these organisms, such as mollusks, they do have gills that the hemolymph will pass over to help pick up oxygen, and then it will move into the vessel to be pumped out again and directly over the tissues. So what we see is that we can have simple hearts that help to pump and circulate the hemolymph. Sometimes muscular movement is also adequate enough to help move the hemolymph around. And once again, these are open spaces where you have to bathe all of the cells in the hemolymph to help carry nutrients in some organisms, and then nutrients and oxygen in others. And so we have to keep moving it around and circulating it to make sure that it's reaching all of the cells. Now, because the vessels are open, hemolymph is under what we consider low pressure, and there really is no way to control where the fluid goes. So, for example, like in clams, with pumping, it just sort of goes all over the tissues. So this is not a problem, especially if you're like a clam stuck to a certain a certain spot. You're not moving around, you're sedentary, you don't have high oxygen requirements like some other organisms might. And so this undirected movement of hemolymph is normally not a problem. But we see some very active organisms that are utilizing hemolymph as their circulatory system. So, for example, in insects, remember I mentioned they do not use their circulatory system for respiration. So what they have is they have their hemolymph bathing their tissues to help carry nutrients around. But then they utilize their tracheal system to branch to their individual cells to get oxygen to them. And so this tracheal system helps overcome the low pressure hemolymph by allowing oxygen to get directly to the cells, which is good for their lifestyle in that they're flying, they have rapid movements, and so the insects not relying on their circulatory system is absolutely all right because they have their very specialized respiratory system. Now, other crustaceans, for example, that we see, such as a crawfish, if we see this here, they have gills. And so what they do is that their hemolymph will pass over their gills to help pick up oxygen, but these are still active. They swim around, and so they have these open-ended vessels, these smaller branching open-ended vessels that help to direct the hemolymph more directly to the active tissue. So, for example, if you look at the crawfish here, we see these little blue vessels at the back end of the crawfish, open-ended vessels. So those are being directed to the muscles of the tail to help that crawfish be able to facilitate rapid movements with the tail. So you also see little vessels coming off down here on the bottom. If you look towards the legs, you see little vessels going to like each little leg. And so this is helping to direct the hemolymph to help get the oxygen to their more energetic needed tissues. Okay, so stop and think for a second. What is the connective tissue found in open circulatory systems? And of course, the answer here is going to be hemolymph. Okay, so when you have an open circulatory system, remember the hemolymph is directly bathing the tissues. And I just want to remind you again that in some organisms, hemolymph carries both nutrients and oxygen. So, for example, like in the crawfish or in the clams, while in insects, the hemolymph is only carrying nutrients. They rely on their tracheal system for oxygen. This is something that gets students every year, so just make sure you keep that in mind. Now, the next type of circulatory system we're going to talk about are closed circulatory systems. And the connective tissue found in closed circulatory systems is what we typically call blood. And so it's going to be confined to a vascular setup to where you have no open-ended vessels. The vessels are all connected to one another in some way and are all connected to a muscular heart. And so that muscular heart helps to move the blood through the closed circulatory system vessels. So we have this conflict that occurs in closed circulatory systems. So you need enough pressure to be generated by your muscular pump, so your hump, to be able to overcome resistance of the vessel. So you can imagine that, if you're trying to pump blood all the way to your toes, there's going to be a lot more resistance because you have a lot more length of vessel to travel to. So you need to have enough positive pressure to move the blood all the way through those vessels. But then you also have to have a way for the blood to slow down enough for gas exchange to occur with the tissues. And so we'll see that the blood pressure and flow rate will drop drastically once the blood hits the small vessels to help facilitate the necessary gas exchange for cellular respiration. So there are two major advantages to closed circulatory systems. So first of all is that we're constantly going to be able to direct oxygen to the tissues that need them. Every single cell is going to come in contact with the capillary, and so oxygen can be delivered at a high rate. We can also vary blood flow to tissues based on the need. So we sort of talked about this when we talked about the pressure equation and how we can change resistance. And if you want to have blood flow to a tissue, you can dilate vessels. If you want to restrict blood flow, you can constrict vessels. And so we can actually be more directive in where we're sending blood in the body versus, for example, the sedentary open circulatory system organisms where you have no way to direct the connective tissue flow. Closed circulatory systems are found in vertebrates, they're found in annelid worms, and they're found in cephalopod mollusks, so things like cuttlefish and octopi and squids. So which one of these organisms does not have a closed circulatory system? So take a quick look and see. And the answer here is going to be the fly. So the fly has an open circulatory system, and just a reminder that they rely on their tracheal system for supplying oxygen.